Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Land acquisition by state governments all across the country, ostensibly for the purposes of development, has been a raging issue. The latest controversy regarding land acquisition in and around the area of Greater Noida in Uttar Pradesh has been in the news recently. Farmers here have protested the lack of adequate compensation for the lands that they have lost. We have with us Mr. S.P. Shukla, former member of the Planning Commission, and with whom we shall discuss this important issue. Mr. Shukla, the Colonial Act of 1894, Land Acquisition Act of 1894, clearly is not adequate enough to address the grievances of farmers in particular. What major changes do you propose in this act so that this is a far more humane way of acquiring land?
You know, as you said, this whole question has acquired kind of a focus of attention, political attention, and it's not merely a question of acquiring land for so-called development, and it's not just the 1894 Land Acquisition Act. There are similar acts in the different states, state acts. There are also acts like ACZ, which acquire another name for doing the same thing. And this whole question has to be seen not so much in the context of some amendments to be moved in some acts, but the wider context, and the wider context is the land question. It is more than land acquisition, it's the land question. And I would like to answer your question in that wider context. The demand for little more compensation, demand for some jobs in the new projects which come up, demands for kind of resistance to land being taken because that's the only means of livelihood. All these, and then ultimately the whole question of food security coming out of transfer of agricultural land to non-agricultural purposes, and the lack of food security and the consequences thereby in terms of malnutrition, etc. So all these are symptoms of the basic land question in this polity, and the land question is haunting the polity. It's raising its head everywhere, and it has of late it has been raising its head again and again right at under the nose of the central government of India. One fact I would like to underline: there has been a dramatic drop in the arable area in this country, and this has happened in every state without exception. Something like 12.5 crore hectares cultivable area has gone down in a decade from 1993 to 2003, something like 1.8 crore, that is 18 million hectares drop, which is a huge thing. Now, this has happened, and this has happened without exception. So, implications of that on the macro scale regarding the food security are very important. And whenever we talk of land acquisition amendment, we forget this bigger context. One is the food security, the other is the loss of livelihood, the only means of livelihood that ordinary poor peasantry has. And this is a comment, this is a very striking, telling comment on the anti-peasant policies of the government, particularly in the decade of economic reforms, that there has been such a dramatic drop in the cultivable area. So, this is the context. Now, there have been amendment has been suggested in the amendment bill, and there have been comments on that. The Joint Parliamentary Committee has gone into it. What are these basic amendments they are talking of? It is either obfuscation of the main problem which I mentioned, or tinkering with the main problem. Neither will do. Neither will do.
Addressing the agrarian question or the agrarian crisis centrally is the key that central government should tackle, right? Instead of looking at this as a land problem vis-a-vis conversion of land into development. That's exactly what you're trying to say.
And there, let's be clear that the agrarian crisis, which is haunting the land question, it needs basic structural change in the economy. It can't be done by one amendment here and the repeal of another act there. So, we keep that background in mind and then come to the concrete as to what is happening. So, the first thing is that the 1894 Land Acquisition Act, which you said is a colonial act, it's a out and out colonial legacy, despite amendments moved here and there, but it's out and out colonial legacy. That has to be thrown out, lock, stock and barrel. It's not a question of because it is founded in the principle of eminent domain. And eminent domain is the concept which is enabling this kind of high-handed behavior on the part of the state, that is the central government as well as state governments, and now the big capital in cahoots with, they are in the state governments and the central government are in cahoots with them. So, both together are pushing this instrument in order to further their own purpose, which ultimately is speculative interest in land, and then many other things that come and which they call in the kind of a rubric of development.
You talked about speculative interest in land.
Yeah.
That's the interesting point here. The use of eminent domain is not to acquire land for productive purposes generally, but to use it for speculative purposes and to give it to real estate developers who have made a killing by speculating on it, by developing it minimally and then sending it to secondary developers and so on and so forth. And that is another reason for the grievances among the farmers, because they say that they don't really get the due prices for the land that they have sold, to which their livelihoods had been dependent upon. Right.
You know, if you look at it around what is happening in, say, Noida or what happened in Gurgaon in Haryana, if you look at that and maybe something not happening in Faridabad, then this question becomes the kind of a burning question, namely, somebody takes away my land under the Land Acquisition Act, and then he buys it and then he sells it and he makes a huge profit and I get little out of it. Now, this is only one part of the problem. This is a genuine problem, but it is only one part. Only those who have some spare land to part with, they ask for bigger compensation. And then many so-called farmers leaders, they also take up this as the main issue. But remember, in the West UP as well as in the Eastern UP and many other areas, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, West Bengal, it's not a question of getting compensation, it's a question of refusing to part with land. Right. This is the larger question of the peasantry, and this has not been very much highlighted either by the media or in the government analysis. So, the question of total loss of the only means of livelihood is a much bigger question which also has to be addressed. And when we talk of amendment, then we have to talk in terms of stopping this kind of dramatic drop in the cultivable area, stopping the speculative diversion of land, for speculative purposes, and also ensuring that the only means of livelihood which is available to a large mass of peasantry is not taken away by force through some legal kind of a fiction of eminent domain. These are the kind of objectives that you have to have in mind when we look at the question of land acquisition. And I must add that what is being proposed in an amendment does not touch any of these issues. It merely talks in terms of some more compensation, market rate.
Unfortunately, not only that, but the refrain adopted by commentators in the corporate press, if you can call that, is that measures should be taken so that private developers and private interests would deal directly with the...
Yes, even this. And the answer of that in terms of 70-30 formula, which is now one of the major elements of the proposed amendment, that also doesn't solve the problem. Because the 70-30 amendment, that is 70 being bought through the market forces and 30 being acquired by the government, the question really is the market and the government have colluded in order to bring about this dramatic drop in the cultivable area, and also this dramatic dispossession, actually accumulation by dispossession, which is the phenomenon which we are seeing. Now, it is the collaboration, it's the of market and the government. Now, this has to be attacked, and this is not being highlighted by the corporate press.
So, in essence, you are trying to say that don't look at land acquisition in isolation from what the peasantry is already facing in terms of the agrarian crisis in the country today, right? So, therefore, the government should have a far more wholehearted policy at looking at steps to ameliorate the livelihoods of peasants and not just take away those livelihoods and leave them to the speculations of the market.
Yeah, and I would say that in order to arrive there, we have to take certain steps. And the first step would be the repeal of the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 and similar other legislations which are founded in the principle of eminent domain. Second, other acts such as SEZ Act, which also another name, acquisition of the land from the peasantry, that also has to be repealed. And then one has to think in terms of immediate steps, namely you stop not only the government acquisition but also the market forces, for which there should be a immediate ban on the transfer of agricultural land to non-agricultural purposes, and particularly to foreigners and the NRIs and the big corporates. So that should be the next step. Then the only by consent of the Gram Sabha, any acquisition or any transfer of agricultural land to non-agricultural purposes for a specifically stated social purpose to be so accepted by the Gram Sabha, and all the members of the Gram Sabha should be allowed. So this becomes an exceptional, because what we need is a thorough re-examination of the approach and a reformulation of a land policy.
Specifically on the Greater Noida agitation, the land that has been acquired or sought to be acquired is for the purposes of providing housing to middle class families who are basically trying to relocate themselves in that area while working in the NCR region. Now, what do you think would be a far more progressive way of assuring housing for these people rather than this slightly more anarchic route?
Yeah, actually, acquisition of land for urban development has been an old thing. You used to have in the olden days improvement trust, you had a DDA, you had this. But for 20, 30 years when this happened, and almost every town which expanded, the town improvement or urban improvement trust was set up and they acquired some land. The scale was small and there was some justice involved. Now what is happening is the scale is much bigger and the purpose is not necessarily the acquisition of land for those the large number of people who need some housing, etc. Now if that happens, there won't be so much of resistance. But what happens is, in the name of express highway, in the name of expansion or big malls coming up, or you are bringing in the big capital which is making this as only a ruse for acquiring land and then dealing in speculative purposes. So genuine purpose of lower middle class, urban middle class, and for them the residential land, if that is there, I don't think there will be such a hue and cry about it. It happens as in Vidarbha, for example, huge power projects are coming up and a large area of agricultural land is being, as it happened in Dadri in UP, or is happening in Orissa. So the first thing is ensure that the transfer either through market or land acquisition to non-agricultural purpose should be stopped altogether, and then take it as an exception rather than as a rule.
Thank you so much.
And the one more thing I would like to say, that is, what you need is really a national land use policy. There have been attempts in the Planning Commission to tackle this problem. It has never succeeded. Then it kind of went into various diversions, and then the regional land use and watershed and that kind of thing came up. But you need a national land use commission to be appointed, which will, one of its jobs will be to have this kind of holistic approach to transfer of land to non-agricultural purposes. At the same time, it should evolve, ultimate objective should be decommodifying land. That is the objective. And for that, and the policy objective should be peasant centric, then ecology friendly, equity oriented, this kind of approach to land, and then ensuring food security and promoting solidarity of all those who are living on the land. That is not necessarily peasantry, but also others who are landless but dependent on the land. So it will have to be a holistic approach to land use, and that policy has to be evolved as an emergent kind of an issue. Unless we do that, all this tinkering and obfuscation will not help.